Karen told me to stick to fast food. I'm a Harvard-trained prosecutor. The sizzle of grilling onions and the cheerful banter of the Saturday morning crowd at the Meadowbrook Farmers Market were a welcome change of pace from the often stark and always tense atmosphere of the courtroom. For the past few months, I'd been volunteering a few hours each weekend at my friend Liam's gourmet burger stall, Liam's Lux Burgers. It was a way to de-stress, to reconnect with the community on a more casual level, and frankly, Liam made a damn good burger. Plus, the extra cash didn't hurt while I was navigating the complexities of a recent pro bono case that seemed determined to consume every waking moment. My usual weekday attire of sharp suits and polished shoes was swapped for a comfortable t-shirt, jeans, and a slightly grease-splattered apron. Most of the market goers knew me simply as Alex, Liam's friend, who helps out, and I preferred it that way. The less they knew about my weekday occupation, the more genuine the interactions felt. It was a small taste of anonymity, a brief escape from the weight of legal responsibility that usually rested squarely on my shoulders. Meadowbrook, despite its picturesque charm and friendly facade, had its share of, well, let's just say opinionated residents. And at the forefront of this cohort stood Karen Mitchell. Karen was, as many in town had come to learn, a woman of strong convictions and an even stronger belief in her own impeccable judgment. Her reign extended far beyond the confines of her perfectly manicured lawn in the prestigious Willow Creek Estates. Karen held court on everything from the proper placement of holiday decorations to the acceptable decibel level of children playing in public parks. Her weapon of choice was often a condescending remark delivered with an air of unimpeachable authority. My own encounters with Karen had been blessedly limited, confined mostly to brief, impersonal interactions at the local grocery store or post office. She had that uncanny ability to size people up within seconds, categorizing them based on her own arbitrary social hierarchy. And those in service roles, I had observed, often found themselves on the receiving end of her thinly veiled disdain. Liam's Lux Burgers was a popular spot at the farmers market, often drawing a long line of hungry customers. This particular Saturday was no exception. The aroma of freshly ground beef in Liam's secret spice blend wafted through the air, enticing passers-by. I was expertly flipping patties on the grill, the rhythmic sizzle a familiar and comforting sound, while Liam handled the orders and cash register. The line stretched back a good 10 people when I first noticed Karen approaching. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleamed under the morning sun, and her designer sunglasses shielded her eyes as she surveyed the scene with an expression that suggested she had just encountered a particularly unpleasant odor. She bypassed the end of the line, marching directly to the front as if her time was infinitely more valuable than everyone else's. "Excuse me," she declared, her voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the cheerful market chatter. "I need to place an order, and I haven't got all day to stand around with these people." She gestured dismissively at the patiently waiting customers. Liam, ever the polite businessman, looked up from taking an order. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to Liam's Lux Burgers. If you could just join the line, I'll be with you as soon as possible." Karen's nostrils flared. "Join the line? Do you know who I am?" "I'm a regular at the Willow Creek Garden Club, and I expect a certain level of expediency." Liam, who had likely encountered this kind of behavior before, maintained his cheerful demeanor. "I understand, ma'am, but we serve everyone in order. It won't be long." Karen's gaze then fell upon me, diligently working the grill. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she took in my apron and my focused concentration on the sizzling burgers. A look of thinly veiled disdain crossed her face. "Honestly," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "this whole setup looks rather unsanitary. And the way you're just slaving over that grill, you look like you should probably stick to fast food." The insult, delivered with such casual superiority, hung in the air. The cheerful market chatter seemed to momentarily cease as several nearby customers turned to witness the exchange. Liam's friendly smile tightened ever so slightly. I paused my flipping, my hand hovering over a half-cooked patty, and met Karen's gaze directly. The casual cruelty of her remark, the immediate dismissal of someone she perceived as being in a service role, was a familiar and frankly tiresome display of unwarranted arrogance. Little did she know that the man slaving over the grill held a law degree from Harvard and spent his weekdays arguing cases in a courtroom, a world she would likely find far more intimidating than a bustling farmer's market. The conflict had been joined, the stage set for a delicious serving of irony. The momentary hush that fell over Liam's Luxburger stand was broken by Liam's smooth recovery. "Well, ma'am," he said, his voice still cheerful, but with a subtle edge I recognized as his handling difficult customers tone. "Alex here makes a mean burger. Our customers seem to think so. Judging by the line." He gestured to the patiently waiting crowd. Karen's expression remained unmoved. "Humph. I highly doubt the culinary expertise of someone who clearly belongs in a less demanding profession." She punctuated her remark with a dismissive wave of her hand, her gaze flicking back to Liam. "Now, are you going to take my order or not? I have a very important charity luncheon to attend." Liam, ever the pragmatist, decided the best course of action was to expedite the transaction. "Of course, ma'am. What can I get for you?" Karen's order was predictably fussy. A Lux Lean burger, leanest patty, no bun, extra lettuce, tomato, and onion on the side, dressing served separately, and a small bottle of artisanal water. As Liam took her order in payment, Karen continued to cast disdainful glances in my direction, occasionally muttering under her breath about the state of the service industry these days. I returned to flipping burgers, the rhythmic sizzle a welcome distraction from the unpleasant interaction. The casual arrogance of people like Karen never ceased to amaze me. The immediate assumption that someone in a service role was somehow less intelligent or less capable was a prejudice I had encountered far too often, even in the supposedly enlightened circles I sometimes frequented. Over the next few weeks, my weekend shifts at Liam's Lux Burgers continued, and so did my occasional run-ins with Karen Mitchell. Her presence at the farmer's market was sporadic, but when she did appear, her interactions were invariably marked by a sense of entitlement and a tendency to look down on those she perceived as being beneath her. One Saturday, while I was helping Liam set up the stall, Karen approached, her face a mask of annoyance. "Excuse me, you've parked your vehicle in a rather inconvenient spot. It's obstructing the flow of pedestrian traffic." She gestured dramatically towards my aging but reliable pickup truck, which was parked in a designated vendor loading zone, exactly where Liam had instructed me to put it. "I'm in the loading zone, ma'am," I replied calmly, tightening a bolt on the grill. "Well, it's still unsightly," she huffed. "This is a community event, and we need to maintain a certain aesthetic." Liam, overhearing the exchange, stepped in. "Morning, Karen. Alex's truck is fine where it is. We need it to transport supplies." Karen's gaze sharpened. "Liam, you really need to manage your staff better. Their lack of consideration is appalling." She shot a pointed look at me. Another time, I witnessed Karen berating a young volunteer at a nearby flower stall for not arranging the bouquets to her liking. Her tone was sharp and condescending, leaving the teenager visibly flustered. I had to restrain myself from intervening, reminding myself that I was off duty and trying to maintain a low profile. The irony of her constant demands for order and adherence to her personal standards, often delivered with a complete lack of courtesy, was a recurring theme. This was a woman who likely prided herself on her social standing and her contributions to the community. Yet her interactions with those she deemed below her were consistently rude and dismissive. Then came the incident with the spilled lemonade. It was a particularly busy Saturday, the sun beating down, and the crowd at the farmer's market was at its peak. A young boy, no older than 7 or 8, accidentally bumped into Karen, causing her to spill her freshly purchased lemonade all over her pristine white pantsuit. The boy's mother rushed over, her face a picture of apology and concern. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. Are you all right?" Karen's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. She unleashed a torrent of sharp words, berating the child for his clumsiness and his mother for her lack of supervision. Her voice was loud and shrill, drawing the attention of several nearby vendors and customers. The little boy burst into tears, his mother's face paling with embarrassment. I watched the scene unfold, my blood beginning to boil. The sheer lack of empathy and the public humiliation of a child over a spilled drink was appalling. Liam, equally disgusted, was about to intervene when I subtly shook my head. I had a feeling this situation might escalate in a way that would inadvertently reveal my true profession, something I was still trying to avoid. However, Karen wasn't finished. Her gaze swept over the small crowd that had gathered, landing on me as I continued to work the grill. "And you, Nyachamaj," she exclaimed, pointing a finger in my direction, "you people need to be more aware of your surroundings. This kind of chaos is simply unacceptable at a community event." The implication, once again, was that those of us working at the market were somehow responsible for the clumsy mishap of a child. The insult, delivered with such sweeping generalization and directed at me while I was simply trying to earn an honest day's work, finally pushed me past my limit. I turned off the grill, wiped my hands on my apron, and met Karen's furious gaze. "Ma'am," I said, my voice calm but carrying a new weight, "accidents happen. It was a child who spilled a drink. Perhaps a little empathy would be more appropriate than public condemnation." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Empathy for that? Honestly, you people have no sense of decorum. You should stick to what you know, grilling greasy food, and leave the social graces to those who understand them." The condescending jab, the dismissive "you people," the implication that my profession somehow precluded me from understanding basic human decency, it was all classic Karen. But this time, her arrogance had crossed a line. She had not only insulted a child and his mother, but had also, once again, belittled my current occupation in a public forum. The conflict was no longer just a series of minor irritations. It was a direct confrontation fueled by Karen's unwavering sense of superiority. And little did she know, she was about to learn that judging a book by its cover, or a person by their apron, could have far-reaching consequences. The tense silence that followed my quiet reprimand hung in the air. The cheerful atmosphere of the farmer's market momentarily subdued. Several nearby customers, having witnessed Karen's outburst in my measured response, looked on with a mixture of curiosity and perhaps a hint of anticipation. Liam, his jaw tight, was about to step in, but I subtly waved him off. This was a conversation I needed to have, and it needed to be on my terms. Karen, however, was far from chastened. Her face flushed with indignation, her eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses. "And who do you think you are, lecturing me about empathy and decorum?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "You're just some burger flipper. You have no right to comment on my social interactions." The dismissive, "just some burger flipper," hung in the air, a perfect encapsulation of her condescending worldview. The irony, of course, was that the burger flipper she so readily dismissed held a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School and spent his weekdays arguing cases in front of judges, often dealing with individuals whose lack of empathy and decorum had landed them in serious legal trouble. "Ma'am," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the simmering anger beneath the surface, "while I may be helping out a friend at his burger stall today, my professional background is perhaps more relevant to discussions of social interaction and consequences than you might assume." Karen scoffed. "Karen, relevant? What could your fast food experience possibly have to do with proper social conduct?" "Well," I replied, a hint of a smile playing on my lips, "in my professional life, I often deal with individuals who exhibit a distinct lack of proper social conduct, and I frequently help determine the consequences of those actions." Karen's skepticism was palpable. "Consequences? What kind of consequences could someone in your position possibly impose?" "The kind that can significantly impact someone's life and liberty," I said, my gaze unwavering. "The kind that are determined by the laws of this state." A flicker of unease finally crossed Karen's face, though her arrogance still held strong. "Laws? What are you talking about? Are you threatening me?" "Not at all, ma'am," I assured her. "I'm simply pointing out that judging individuals based on their current occupation can often lead to inaccurate and potentially regrettable assumptions." Just then, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Alex, is everything all right here?" It was Detective Miller, a local police officer who was a regular at the farmer's market and a frequent customer at Liam's Lux Burgers. He approached our small group, his brow furrowed with concern as he took in Karen's flushed face and my calm but serious demeanor. "Detective," Karen said, her voice suddenly taking on a more polite and almost aggrieved tone, This individual has been incredibly rude and confrontational. Detective Miller's gaze shifted to me, a questioning look in his eyes. He knew I helped out at the market and had always known me to be even-tempered. Alex, what's going on? He asked, his tone neutral. Before I could answer, Karen interjected. He just started lecturing me after that clumsy child spilled lemonade on my very expensive pantsuit. Honestly, the lack of respect. Detective Miller listened patiently, then turned back to me. Alex, your side of the story? Detective, I said calmly, I simply suggested that perhaps a little empathy might be more appropriate in response to a child's accidental spill than public beratement. Ms. Mitchell took offense to my comment. Detective Miller's gaze flickered between Karen's indignant expression and my measured tone. He had likely witnessed Karen's forceful personality on more than one occasion. Well, Karen, he said, his tone diplomatic, accidents do happen, and Alex is usually a pretty level-headed guy. Karen's frustration seemed to reach a boiling point. Level-headed, he told me that his professional life involves determining consequences for people. It sounded like a threat. Detective Miller raised an eyebrow, looking from Karen to me with renewed interest. Consequences? What kind of professional life is that, Alex? I hesitated for a moment, a decision forming in my mind. The anonymity I had enjoyed at the farmer's market was about to come to an end, but perhaps it was time for Karen Mitchell to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers. Detective, I said, meeting his gaze directly, during the week, I work as a prosecutor for the Meadowbrook District Attorney's Office. The effect on Karen was instantaneous and dramatic. Her mouth dropped open, her eyes widening behind her sunglasses in utter disbelief. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and slightly unsteady. The burger flipper she had so readily dismissed was actually a prosecutor, someone with the power to bring legal consequences down upon those who broke the law. A stunned silence fell over the small group. Detective Miller's eyebrows shot up. Even Liam, who had been trying to remain neutral, looked genuinely surprised. Several nearby customers gasped audibly. Karen's carefully constructed facade of superiority finally shattered. The realization of her monumental blunder, insulting and condescending to a prosecutor in public, seemed to overwhelm her. You're a prosecutor, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded calmly. That's correct, Ms. Mitchell. Harvard Law, class of 2010. The weight of my words hung in the air. The woman who had told me to stick to fast food was now face to face with the very person who could potentially prosecute her if she ever ran afoul of the law. The irony was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Karen's eyes darted nervously between me and Detective Miller, a look of dawning horror spreading across her face. The woman who had so readily judged others based on their occupation was now confronted with the reality that her own arrogance had led her to insult someone with significant authority, a mistake that could potentially have far-reaching consequences, especially if her own behavior ever warranted legal scrutiny. The cheerful sounds of the market now seemed to underscore the profound irony of the situation, a stark reminder of the importance of humility and the dangers of judging others based on superficial appearances. The revelation of my profession hung in the air, the bustling sounds of the farmer's market seeming to fade into a muted background hum. Karen's face was a study in shock and dawning apprehension. The confident, often imperious, demeanor she usually exuded had completely evaporated, replaced by a palpable nervousness. Detective Miller, after a moment of surprised silence, chuckled softly. Well, Karen, he said, a wry smile playing on his lips. Looks like Alex is more than just a burger flipper. Liam, who had been observing the exchange with wide eyes, finally broke his silence. Dude, you're a prosecutor. You never told me. I shrugged, a small smile touching my lips. It doesn't really come up when I'm flipping burgers. Karen, however, was still reeling. Her eyes darted between me and Detective Miller, a clear understanding of the potential implications of her earlier behavior beginning to dawn on her. Insulting a stranger was one thing. Insulting a prosecutor in public was quite another. Mr. Alex, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea. I just assumed. Her voice trailed off, unable to articulate the full extent of her misjudgment. Assumptions can often be inaccurate, Ms. Mitchell, I replied calmly, echoing a sentiment I had shared with other Karens in different contexts. Perhaps in the future, a little more courtesy towards those in service roles might be prudent. Karen nodded quickly, her eyes wide. Yes, yes, of course. I I apologize. I am so sorry for my rude remarks. The sincerity in her voice was a stark contrast to her earlier condescension. The tension in the immediate vicinity began to dissipate, though a few curious onlookers still lingered. Detective Miller clapped me on the shoulder. Well, Alex, you certainly know how to handle a difficult customer. Liam, still processing the news, grinned. Man, I've been working alongside a secret weapon. I simply smiled. The immediate conflict had been resolved, but the potential ramifications of Karen's behavior lingered in the air. As a prosecutor, I was bound by a code of conduct, and while her rudeness at the farmer's market didn't constitute a prosecutable offense, it certainly provided insight into her character. Over the next few weeks, Karen's behavior at the farmer's market, and indeed around Meadowbrook, seemed to undergo a noticeable shift. Her interactions with service staff became markedly more polite, and her pronouncements on the perceived shortcomings of others seemed to diminish. Perhaps the realization that the help she so readily dismissed could hold positions of authority had given her pause. I continued my weekend shifts at Liam's Luxburgers, the initial awkwardness of my revealed profession fading into a shared amusement with Liam and a newfound cautious politeness from Karen whenever she happened to visit the market. I was in my office at the district attorney's office, reviewing a case file involving a minor public nuisance charge stemming from a neighborhood dispute. The details were fairly mundane: excessive noise complaints, allegations of property line encroachment, the kind of petty squabbles that often arose in close-knit suburban communities. As I read through the complainant's statement, a familiar name jumped off the page: Karen Mitchell. The defendant in the case was her next-door neighbor, accused of repeatedly violating neighborhood noise ordinances. A wave of grim amusement washed over me. The HOA Karen who had so condescendingly told me to stick to fast food was now embroiled in a legal dispute that had landed on my desk. The irony was almost too perfect. As the prosecuting attorney assigned to the case, I was obligated to handle it professionally and impartially. However, I couldn't help but recall Karen's arrogant demeanor at the farmer's market and her dismissive attitude towards me. The initial hearing was interesting. Karen, accompanied by a somewhat bewildered-looking attorney, presented her case with the same unwavering conviction and sense of entitlement she had displayed at the farmer's market. She detailed the neighbor's alleged transgressions with dramatic flair, painting a picture of a peaceful suburban existence constantly disrupted by loud music and unruly gatherings. The neighbor, a mild-mannered retiree, presented a contrasting view, claiming that the noise levels were reasonable and that Karen had a history of making unreasonable demands and escalating minor disagreements. As I listened to both sides, my mind couldn't help but drift back to Karen's condescending remarks. The woman who had looked down on me for flipping burgers was now seeking justice in a courtroom, and I was the one holding the power to influence the outcome. The resolution of the case wasn't a dramatic courtroom showdown. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony, it became clear that while the neighbor had occasionally exceeded reasonable noise levels, Karen's complaints were often exaggerated and driven by a desire for absolute quiet and control. I proposed a settlement. The neighbor would agree to adhere to reasonable noise ordinances, and Karen would agree to engage in more constructive communication with her neighbor in the future. The judge approved the settlement. While the legal outcome was fair and impartial, there was a certain satisfaction in seeing Karen, the self-appointed arbiter of neighborhood standards, having to navigate the complexities of the legal system. The woman who had told me to stick to fast food now found herself subject to the very legal processes I was responsible for upholding. The next time I saw Karen at the farmer's market, her demeanor was markedly different. She offered a polite, almost deferential nod, and her interactions with Liam and me were noticeably subdued. She never again made any condescending remarks about my weekend job. The experience served as a quiet reminder that judging individuals based on their perceived social standing or current occupation is a fool's errand. Everyone has a story, and sometimes the person you least expect holds a position of influence that could one day impact your own life. And for Karen Mitchell, the Harvard-trained prosecutor moonlighting as a burger flipper served as a potent, if perhaps unintended, lesson in humility.